So I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to just keep an eye on the waiting room. So William, you go by Kent, correct?
I do.
Not William. Yeah. So Kent Krueger is the #1 best-selling author of more than 20 books, including the Cork O'Connor series. You are a New York Times best-selling author of This Tender Land, Ordinary Grace, winner of the Edgar Award for Best Novel, as well as 18 acclaimed books in the Cork O'Connor series, mystery series, which was my introduction to your book, The Lightning Strike, which was I enjoyed very much. But I love This Tender Land.
Good. So typically when you meet via Zoom for your book club, you talk about the book, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, well, that's what I'd like to do tonight. But what I'm going to do is, how about this? What I'll do is tell you a little bit more about myself, what it is that I do, maybe why I began writing in the first place and the journey that led to the writing of This Tender Land. And then we can open it up to questions and discussions. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
All right.
Perfect.
So I do publish under that. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for being here this evening. It's my pleasure to join you for this discussion. I do publish under that very literary thing, three-name thing, you know, William Kent Krueger. But I go by my middle, I have always gone by my middle name, Kent. So as we have a chance to talk this evening, feel free to call me Kent. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I have for the last 40 plus years with my wife of, let's see, last March 10th, she was my wife of 48 years. Our children live here, our grandson is here. Despite the fact that we do have those legendarily bitter winters, I love St. Paul. I love Minnesota. I love living here. I love the people here. Before I began to write standalone novels like This Tender Land and its companion novel, Ordinary Grace, I was probably best known as the author of the, oh boy, do I love saying this, author of the New York Times best-selling Cork O'Connor mystery series, which is set up in the great Northwoods of Minnesota. My protagonist in that series, Cork O'Connor, is a man of mixed heritage. He's part Irish American and he's part Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, which is the largest tribal affiliation we have in northern Minnesota. I published the first book in that series in 1998, and 17 more have followed. The most recent came out last August, Lightning Strike, which was Claire's first introduction to my work, apparently. Glad you liked it, Claire.
Did I enjoyed it.
And along the way, I had an opportunity to write a couple of books then, not part of my series, Ordinary Grace in 2013, which, as Claire pointed, won a lot of awards, the Edgar Award included. And in 2019, I published the companion novel, This Tender Land. So, so I have 18 books in a mystery series. So the truth is, I cut my teeth on mysteries. Oh, but let me back up a little bit. Let me talk a little bit about why I write in the first place. You know, I have always wanted to be a writer. I mean, always. The first story I remember writing was a short story in the 3rd grade. It was called The Walking Dictionary. Now, I got to tell you this. My father was a high school English teacher. Any English teachers in the group this evening? None? Okay. So when I was a kid, my father, the high school English teacher, was always storming around the house ranting something like, nobody uses dictionaries enough. Nobody uses dictionaries enough. So in the 3rd grade, I wrote a short story called The Walking Dictionary, which was in fact about a dictionary that didn't think it was being used enough. It magically sprouted legs so that it could toddle off into the world and go to the people that needed it. My 3rd grade teacher went gaga over that story. My folks oohed and awed over that story. I swear to you, in the 3rd grade, I knew I was destined to be a writer, a storyteller. So I have always written. And as I said, I began my career really as a mystery writer. But about 10 years, 12 years ago now, a story idea came to me that wasn't a part of my Cork O'Connor series. And when I proposed that project to my publisher, they didn't want it. In fact, they called me out to New York City in kind of a panic and set me down and said, Kent, we only want Cork O'Connor novels from you. So I knew if I wrote this piece, it was going to be a risky proposition, but it was a story that spoke to me in such a compelling way that I knew I had to write it. So across the course of the next 3 years, without a contract, I composed the manuscript for a novel called Ordinary Grace. Has anybody in the group read Ordinary Grace? Okay, I see a couple of hands up there. Even though when I finished the manuscript, even though my publisher told me they didn't really want it, I went ahead and sent it to my editor at Simon and Schuster. She fell in love with it. She said, of course, we're going to publish it. And I did. And Ordinary Grace has just had this really remarkable, really gratifying reception from critics and readers alike. It won tons of awards when it came out. It's been translated into more than 24 foreign languages. So far, it's sold well over 1 million copies. And when my publisher saw how well that book was doing, boy, did they want another book just like it. So I signed a contract for a companion novel to Ordinary Grace. They paid me a load of money. And I spent the next 2 years writing what I believed would be the companion novel to Ordinary Grace. Now, that manuscript was contractually due to my publisher 6 years ago. 2 months before the contractual deadline, I set up a meeting in Chicago to talk to my agent about revisions to the piece because there were problems with it. I knew it, she knew it. 2 days before our meeting, I sent her a note saying, when we meet, I don't want to talk about how we revise this piece. I want to talk about how we keep it from being published. Because it wasn't the story I'd imagined it would be. I had no idea how to make it that story. And frankly, my heart wasn't in it. My publisher actually turned out to be pretty understanding. They said, fine, you don't have to give us this manuscript, but you still owe us a companion novel. So here's what was going on. The expectations for that companion novel, that follow-up novel, were enormous. And the whole time I was trying to write the piece, I just felt crushed by the weight of all those expectations. And the truth is, while I was writing it, what I was doing was trying to meet everybody else's expectations instead of writing the story that spoke to me from my heart. But as soon as all that weight got lifted off my shoulders and I felt free again, I saw so clearly the story I should have been writing, the story that did speak to me from my heart. And I swear to you, it's a story I've wanted to write since I was 11 years old. When I was 11, that would have been in the 5th grade. Toward the end of that year, our teacher read to the class The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. She did it by reading half an hour after lunch every day. I loved that book. Here was this kid, and he was just like me, and he was out there on the Mississippi River having these really great adventures. And of course, after that, I had to read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which I loved even more. And so across my entire career as a writer, I have wanted someday to write a story that would pay homage to Mark Twain, that might be in its own way an updated version of Huckleberry Finn. And that's where This Tender Land came from. So, what would you like to ask me?
All right, I'll start. So one of the book club members had sent me quite a few questions. So the first one was, what was the reason for Emmy's fit, the fits that she had?
They helped me. They were an entree into the visions that Emmy has. It's not epilepsy. Emmy hit her head, if you remember the story, Emmy hit her head when she was with her father in the field and was in a coma for a while. And when she came out of it, she began to have these fits, but she also began to have prescient visions of the future. And part of that was, so let me talk a little bit about Emmy. Emmy was the last of the vagabonds to come into my thinking as one of the vagabonds. Initially, I created Emmy in my thinking to be simply a daughter for Cora Frost because I thought Cora would be a woman who would have a daughter like Emmy. But the more I wrote Emmy into the scenes, the more I fell in love with her. And when it came time for the boys to run away from the boarding school, I thought, oh crap, they can't leave her. She's in a horrible situation. They have to take her with them. So I knew she was going to be one of the vagabonds at that point, but I needed a role for Emmy to play. My father, the high school English teacher, when I was a kid, he had me reading all of the great hero and heroine quests in literature. And one of the things I remembered from that reading was that very often on one of these quests, a hero or heroine is accompanied by a seer, somebody who can actually look into the future and offer advice, whether it's taken or not. So I decided to make Emmy my seer. Now, that was not a stretch of imagination for me because my mother was a seer. When I was a kid, it wasn't at all uncommon for the telephone to ring and mom would go, "Hey, you know, that's Aunt Joanne, there's trouble." And it was Aunt Joanne and there was trouble. Or she would toss and turn in bed for several days in a row and she would say, "Something bad is coming, something bad is coming." And sure enough, something bad came. So making Emmy a seer was not difficult at all. But I wanted to give the reader a bit of an entree into that ability. Now, I did a lot of research in terms of the odd abilities that people acquire and how they acquire them. And very often people acquire very strange abilities from out of nowhere seemingly when they have a head trauma. And so I decided I would give Emmy the head trauma, and that would, in the same way that Sister Eve suffers a head trauma later on, and that's kind of her way of coming to the abilities that she apparently has. So so that's the whole thing about Emmy, and her fits are not epilepsy. The doctors have ascertained it's not epilepsy. It's simply what she goes through when she is going to see something significant about the future.
And Mo didn't speak, and I saw a question in the list of questions for book groups. The Native Americans didn't have a voice in the book, and I was wondering why.
Because they had no voice. They were people who had no voice. From the late 1880s until 1978, when the National Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, if you were a Native parent and the government came to you and said, "We are going to take your children away, and we're going to cart them off to a boarding school hundreds of miles distant, and you will see them infrequently, or maybe even never again," there was absolutely nothing you could do about that. It was the law that you had to give the government your children. You had no voice. And so Mo stands for a culture that had no voice. And you really don't hear the voice of the Native people in the boarding school much at all. Again, for the same reason, they simply didn't have a voice. They were there, but they didn't have a voice. But certainly Mose acquires a voice of his own throughout the story. He just doesn't speak it as the rest of us do. He becomes a profound advocate for his people.
So Leslie was wondering if Native Americans were able to play Major League Baseball then.
Yeah, there were several Major League Baseball players who were Native. Yep.
She was wondering if Sid was on the same page as Sister Eve.
Not really. Sid is a con man. He is a showman. That's what he's all about. You know, I don't know really how Sid feels about Sister Eve's abilities, about Sister Eve's desire really to deliver a loving message to the world. What Sid is about is Sister Eve. He's clearly quite fond of Sister Eve, and he's about promoting the Sword of Gideon healing crusade, getting them into the limelight. That's what Sid is all about. He's not a horrible individual. He simply has his heart in a different place than Sister Eve does.
Was the troop, they were honest though, the people that were with them, like if you had to go one side, they were probably more like Sister Eve than like Sid, correct?
Yeah, I mean, they're good. The people of the Sword of Gideon Healing Crusade are all good people. They're just down on their luck. Some of them are clearly running from the law, but they're not bad people. And Sister Eve, in the way that Sister Eve talks about the divine, a loving, compassionate, forgiving God, Sister Eve takes them in, shows them compassion, and in that way, you know, delivers them from a lot of the difficulties, the travails in their lives.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
There's so many layers to your book and so many wonderful, wonderful, deep characters. Are these people, like, I guess I'm not sure how to put this correctly, what I'm thinking, but basically, like, what kind, are they inspired by people you know, or is it that you do research and then you try to include all that in the book, or how do you piece all this together?
More easily than I had ever imagined, actually. this was a story that I did an enormous amount of research for up front, and also during, and also when I had completed the first draft of the manuscript, making sure that all of the historical underpinnings for the story were correct. In terms of the characters who participate in the story, there are only really two that I'm aware of that really have come out of my own experience. The first was Albert. So I told you that I wanted to do an updated version of Huckleberry Finn. I've always wanted to do an updated version of Huckleberry Finn. And if you remember your Huckleberry Finn, Huck in his journey down the Mississippi River is accompanied by a runaway slave named Jim. For whatever reason, always in my thinking about the story I was going to create, that character would be a Native American kid, a little bit older than my narrator. So I always had Mose in mind. As I began to think about the story more significantly, I realized one of the things I did want to talk about is family. How is family created? Is it all about bloodlines, or are there more dynamic elements involved in the creation of what we call family? And I decided in order to do that, I needed to give Odie some family. So I created an older brother, Albert, for him. And Albert is patterned after my oldest brother, who, like Albert, was always the smartest kid in the room, and he let you know it. And my older brother, like Albert, always knew exactly what I should be doing, how I should be living my life. Emmy, I began my thinking with Emmy with my younger sister. I'm the youngest of three boys, and when we have a younger sister. And my thinking about Emmy began with my youngest sister. So there are two characters in the story that came out of my own experience, but for the most part, the rest of them were creations that came along with that part that they would play in the story. Some of them came because, I don't know how many of you caught this, but I structured this tender land in the same way that Homer structured the Odyssey. Every experience that the vagabonds have mirrors an experience that Odysseus had in his long journey from Troy back to Ithaca. So many of the characters I created, I patterned after characters that Odysseus encountered in his journey from Troy to Ithaca. So Polyphemus, the one-eyed Cyclops, that's One-Eyed Jack, for example. Sister Eve, that's the sorceress Circe. I could go on and on, but so that's pretty much how their characters came. Sister Eve, in truth, I patterned after a fictional character created by Sinclair Lewis for his novel Elmer Gantry. If you maybe you don't remember your Elmer Gantry, but for those of you who don't or haven't read it, Elmer Gantry. Elmer is a con man. He's a charlatan, and he uses religion to advance his own selfish purposes. And at one point in that story, he takes up with a tent revivalist, a tent evangelist named Sharon Falconer, who is a woman of the world. She smokes, she drinks, she carouses with Elmer, but she also believes profoundly that God has tapped her to deliver a loving message to the world. So my thinking about Sister Eve began with Sharon Falconer, and then I fashioned her to my own purposes for my story.
Do many people figure out that Odyssey correlation?
You know, it probably only English majors, literature majors. But, you know, I knew it was going to be over the head of lots of folks, and that didn't bother me because, you know, I had tried to write this story a couple of times, and I was never able to sink my teeth into it. And the reason was I had no structure. I had no idea why these kids were on the river. I had no idea what was going to happen to them or where they were going. But my father had me reading the Iliad and the Odyssey when other kids were reading the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. Never cared much for the Iliad, but I absolutely loved the Odyssey. And so I finally decided, well, what if I borrowed Homer's structure? Could I do it then? And that really was what gave me the ability to actually launch into the writing of this story.
On your website, you have a playlist for book groups. Did you make this playlist?
I did not. My agent and her husband, who are huge music fans, put that together. And if you listen to it, what you'll find is that all of the renditions, I mean, they are, all of the songs that I reference in the story, and they are all renditions that would have been familiar to Odie, were he to hear them while he was on his journey in that summer. It's just a lovely playlist.
I listened to the book. The reader was a great reader. I enjoyed the reader. I don't know if you have any say in that, but for this story, he was a great storyteller.
You know, this was the first time I had any say in who my reader is. Typically, my audio publisher chooses the reader. But for this book, I was sent 3 audition tapes, and we chose Scott Brick from those tapes. I thought he did a pretty good, a very fine job.
I was telling someone today, I fell asleep twice listening to it because he goes, yeah, it's like meditation. I said, yeah, it was like a book for yoga. So then I had to actually get the book to finish the end because I knew I would probably fall asleep again because he had a really nice read. Yeah.
Good. I'm not sure he would consider that a compliment.
Well, it is a compliment. I actually went on looking for other books that he read. So
yeah, he's a very well-known reader. He's won a lot of awards.
I'm going to open it up to see if anyone has any questions. You can type it in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
I have a question. What was do you have like some background in Native American heritage, or is it the area that you live in? Is there a lot of Native American? How did you, it seemed like you were very, you kind of got what they were going through and what was going on. Was that just all your research, or is there some heritage there?
Thanks for the question, Linda. Because of my Cork O'Connor series, I've been working with the Native community here in Minnesota for more than 20 years. We have a significant Native population in Minnesota. In the north, the predominant tribal affiliation is Anishinaabe. In the south, it's Dakota. So I have friends in the Native community, and over the years I've done lots of work with them. I continue to do a lot of research about the natives and the Native community, what's going on in Indian country these days, to help inform my work. And I have no Native blood in me whatsoever. So every time I write about the Native culture, I'm aware that I'm a white guy trespassing on a culture not my own. So I work very hard to get it right. I have friends in the Ojibwe community who, when I finished a manuscript of my Cork O'Connor novel, will read it and vet it for me so that I haven't said anything that's stupid or even worse, offensive. So yeah, I have a vast library of Native American writings, Native American resource materials that help me out a good deal.
So Jen said she loved Ordinary Grace in the chat. And Caroline has a question. Odie's longing for a home and his efforts to get to his aunt to finally realize his goal. If that sense of belonging was captivating, was the brothel setting intentional, or were you trying to give a message to the reader such as no home is perfect? Thank you.
I like that no home is perfect idea, which Odie certainly discovers when he arrives there. You know, if the ending of the novel surprised you as readers, well, it surprised the hell out of me too. When I write a story in my Cork O'Connor series, those are all essentially mysteries, and the mystery is a very tightly woven fabric of storytelling. Everything depends so significantly on everything else, and I think the success of a mystery depends largely on the timing of the reveals. When do you give the reader the clues that are going to be necessary to helping the reader solve the mystery at the heart of the story? So when I write a story in the Cork O'Connor series, I always think that story through as completely as I can before I ever put my fingers to the keyboard. At the end of that thinking process, I know how the story begins. I know how it ends. I know who did what to whom and why. I know the themes I want to weave through the piece. But with This Tender Land, I wanted a different approach, an entirely different kind of experience. I wanted it to be an organic approach. I wanted the reader to read it and feel like it came directly from my heart out to them. So going into the story, I really knew very little about it. I knew it was going to be my updated version, my homage to Mark Twain. I knew that it was going to be set in the Great Depression. One of the reasons I made that decision was one of the things I wanted to write about is the question of who we are at heart as human beings, particularly during periods of great privation, or when great stress is put on us as a society, as a people, in the way we've been experiencing for the last year and a half with this pandemic. During these periods, are we the kind of people who retreat into ourselves and protect only that which is important to us? Or are we the kind of people who, despite how little we might have, we're willing to open our arms and share what we have with those who have less? And I couldn't think of a better period of time to explore that question than during the Great Depression. So I knew the book was going to be set during the Great Depression, and I knew I was going to structure it in the way that Homer structured the Odyssey. And then I took off in the writing, and I allowed the story to reveal itself to me as I was going along. Very often, as I was working on one section, I had no idea what was going to happen in the next section. And when I got the kids to, so I had no idea where the kids were going when I put them on the river. And then Odie, if you remember, opens that stack of letters that they've taken from the Brickman's safe, and he finds the letter from Aunt Julia. And as I was writing this, I'm going, oh, that's interesting. They have an Aunt Julia in St. Louis. So I guess they're going to St. Louis. So finally, I had a destination for them. I'm going, that's great. I had no idea who the hell Aunt Julia was, but I had a destination for them. When I got them to the second to the last section of the book, where they're there on the West Side Flats with Flo and Gertie, I still had no idea what St. Louis and Aunt Julia was all about. But as I was writing that section, I realized everybody but Odie had found there on the West Side Flats what they were looking for. Albert had found Truman Waters in the towboat and that engine he loves working on. Mose had found Forrest and Calvin, two members of his own culture, to help guide him in his understanding. Emmy had found Flo and Gertie, mother figures if that's what she wanted, but Odie still hadn't found home. So I realized the last leg of this journey was for Odie alone, and whatever awaited him in St. Louis was specifically for him. So then I had to begin my thinking about, okay, who is Aunt Julia, and what is it that Odie's going to discover in St. Louis? And that's really where my imagination as a storyteller kicked in, and I really surprised myself with the ending I come up with, I have to be honest. And then, of course, I had to go back into the manuscript and put in all the clues that, when a reader got to that point, had been there for the reader to understand the fact that the boys really aren't brothers, they're cousins,
When I was reading the book, I was just exhausted and I was so hungry. And I don't know how they survived, but they always had an amazing sense of direction, and they always found their way. So I was glad that happened, because I was worried about them during most of the book. But I mean, they worked so hard all day long, and they only ate once a day, and oh my gosh. Anyway,
which was not unusual at all during the Great Depression. So many people suffered in that way during the Great Depression. But if you were worried about the vagabonds as they were making their journey, so was I. I had, as I told you, I had no idea where I was taking them, where they would end up. And I had this really unusual experience in the writing of this manuscript. I fell in love with the vagabonds in a way that I've never fallen in love with characters I've created before. And I was so deeply in love with them that as I was writing the story and had no idea what was going to happen to them, I kept finding myself thinking, oh, please, dear God, let them end up in a good place,
I was so happy. Well, I guess the first couple of chapters, but I was happy when Albert would say, in my 8th decade. I'm like, oh, he lives to be 80. Thank God. When you put that in there, that made my day when I was reading it. Jane has a question.
For an astute reader, that is a comfort, realizing that Odie, in fact, grows to a ripe old age. You don't really know until the very end what happened to everybody else, but you know that Odie at least makes it to the end of the story.
Yeah. So Jane wants to know, how was the title chosen? So many encounters were not tender.
And yet so many of them were. This is a harsh world they're in, and they begin from a really horrific place. But even in that horrific place, there is kindness shown to them. Think about Herman Volz, think about Cora Frost. These are people who really do their best to show the kids some tenderness. And all along in their journey, everywhere they stop, even though they have some difficulties, I mean, One-Eyed Jack in the beginning is not very kind to them, but even he comes around and begins to show his better nature. And for a brief glimpse, we have a brief glimpse of him as a real human being. And then when he comes back into the story, of course, he is very kind and very grateful. And the Sister Eve shows them, and the whole sort of Gideon healing crusade folks show them great kindness. In Hopersville, Odie finds it. They find it again on the West Side Flats with Flo and Gertie. And Odie finds it in the brothel, where he is embraced by the women at the brothel. So I think, in fact, they do find a great deal of tenderness along the way. But let me tell you where the title came from. For a very long time, I didn't have a working title for the manuscript. And then I happened to be traveling through southern Minnesota doing the geographic research for the novel. And I was listening to our public radio station, our classical public radio station. And this piece of music came on that I was completely unfamiliar with, but was just exquisitely beautiful. And at the end of that piece, the announcer came on and he said, "You've been listening to an excerpt from the only opera Aaron Copland ever composed called," and I thought he said, "This Tender Land." The actual title for that opera is The Tender Land. But what I heard was This Tender Land. And I thought, thank you, Lord, there's my title. And again, I believe it's a very appropriate title because in the course of their journey, the children find refuge on the river. They take refuge in the hospitality that the people show them along the way. So I think it is far more tender than it is cruel.
I liked this title. Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to unmute. Or you can type it in the chat.
Can you talk a little bit about Ordinary Grace, and when's your next kind of book like that coming out?
For those of you who have not read Ordinary Grace, here's the down and dirty on that novel. It takes place in the summer of 1961 in New Bremen, the same town that the vagabonds find themselves in when they join up with the Sword of Gideon healing crusade. It's in the very beautiful Minnesota River Valley. Ordinary Grace is the story of a Methodist minister whose beloved child is murdered. That's the compelling mystery component to it. But at heart, it's really the story of what that terrible tragedy does to this family's faith, their relationship with one another, and ultimately the entire fabric of this small town in which they live. I wrote Ordinary Grace. If you were to read my Cork O'Connor series, you would see that very often in those stories, there's an undercurrent that deals with the spiritual journey. It's something that comes quite natural for Cork O'Connor because he's of mixed heritage. So he's a man with a foot in two different spiritual traditions, his white Catholicism, he's Irish Catholic, and his Ojibwe spirituality. So very often in those stories, he's trying to figure out where his unique spiritual path lies. That's been an issue for me my whole life. I'm on a spiritual journey. I think we all are, whether we embrace that or not. And so one of the reasons that I wrote Ordinary Grace was that I had been looking for a story that would allow me to explore more deeply the importance of the spiritual journey in our lives. So there really is a deep foundation of spirituality in that book. In the same way that you'll find it in This Tender Land, Odie's journey is very much a spiritual journey. That's one of the things as a storyteller I love about rivers. They can be metaphors for so many things. And certainly in this story, one of the metaphors that the rivers serve is for Odie's spiritual journey. When we meet Odie, he has, he's a kid and he has a very childlike Old Testament image of God, the wrathful God, the smiting God, the tornado God. Right. And then Sister Eve offers him a different image of the divine, a compassionate God, a forgiving God. And across the whole course of that summer and really his whole life, Odie is trying to wrap his understanding around this great mystery of the divine. And you find that theme then both in my Cork O'Connor series, in Ordinary Grace, and also in This Tender Land. Ordinary Grace, This Tender Land is kind of an epic story. It's painted on a very broad canvas. Ordinary Grace is much more enclosed, compacted story. Takes place, it's really centered around one family through a short period of time in the summer of 1961. So they're very different in terms of that, but many of the same themes are dealt with in both of these books. That's why I think of them as companion novels.
Joanne, I see that you unmuted yourself. Do you have a question?
Oh, I did. I didn't even mean to do that, but I was just observing This Tender Land also just reminded me that it was tender in that it helped to hide the boys on their journey with along the river and with all the coverage by the trees and you know, all the back way they were traveling about and hidden by, you know, making their way into the town through going through a little forest or whatever. So I didn't get the connection at first, but that makes sense.
Well, I'm glad you got the connection because yes, the land treats them in a tender way.
Anyone else have any questions? Oh, wait a minute. Okay, there's one in the chat.
I don't have any questions, but I want to say that listened to This Tender Land, and I also just finished the Grace, and
Ordinary Grace.
I can't. I'm already into your other books, your other mystery books, because I can't put you down.
Boy, do I love hearing that. Thank you, Julie.
Well, when we started talking, he wasn't sure that Westwood would have known about the Cork O'Connell, but I think you have a lot of fans in Westwood, I think.
Oh, that is so good to hear.
So,
Can
Chrissy,
I ask you?
Oh, go ahead.
I just wondered, you said that, you know, obviously you started writing when you were young, but did you pursue writing like out of high school into college, majoring in writing or creative writing, or did you do something else and then get back to the writing?
Yeah, I have always written and I've always been writing stories, but I served a very long apprenticeship. I didn't publish my first novel until I was 48 years old, but I was always writing. I don't have a college degree. I matriculated at Stanford University in the fall of 1969. And in the spring of 70, I was kicked out because I participated in a radical takeover of the administration building. This was during the Vietnam War, and it was part of a protest. Although I attended college for a couple of years after that, it was never in a real concerted way, because I really didn't think college was teaching me what I needed to know in order to be a writer. So I took off and kind of followed the Hemingway School of Education. I logged timber for a while. I worked construction for many years. I mopped hospital floors. And the whole time I was doing that, I was also doing my writing. So I have to be honest with you, I'm not a big believer in writing programs. The problem with them that I see is that so often they tend to try to mold writers in a particular way, depending upon, the program and the instructors that you might have. Because I'm a writer who taught myself to write by sitting down 7 days a week, year after year, and doing the writing. I really think that's how you become a writer. You become a writer simply by writing. The one thing that I would say that the programs, the writing classes that I did take, did for me was they gave me deadlines, so I had to produce things, and they gave me a ready audience, which was always a good thing to have. Does that help?
Yes, I have a son who loves to write and has been writing stories since he was quite young, as the librarians can attest, because he used to have them running around the library finding books for him for his research on his stories. And so I just didn't know, he's in college now, but I want
Is
to
he-
make sure that he doesn't give up on the writing, because I think he has some talent in it.
So as far as you know, Linda, he's still writing.
Yes, not as much as he did when he was younger, but he is still writing.
Okay, well, I hope the fire is still in his belly. And you know, as your mother, as his mother, your role simply is to encourage, encourage, encourage.
Right.
Okay, Christina's wondering which Cork O'Connor series, in the Cork O'Connor series, which one she should start, or you recommend to start with.
So my Cork O'Connor series, there are 18 books in it. The first 17 books in the series span 15 years in the lives of the characters involved. So my answer to that question used to be, it's a much richer experience if you begin with the first one, Iron Lake, and you read the series in order, because then you will see how the characters evolve and age, how the relationships over those 15 years change. So it's just a much richer experience. That said, every writer of a long-running series understands that readers may come to your work in like the 11th or the 14th or the 17th in the series. So every book has to be able to stand alone. It has to be satisfying just within the covers of that particular novel. It can't rely on a reader's understanding of the history that's involved in all of these characters. So you ought to be able to pick up any book in the series. There's two I wouldn't recommend. But any other books in this series, you ought to be able to pick them up and enjoy them. And if you really like them, my hope always is that you go back to the beginning and you start there and you do decide to read them in order. But the most recent book in the series, Lightning Strike, here over my shoulder, is a prequel to the series. It takes place when my main character, Cork O'Connor, is 12 years old. And it requires absolutely no knowledge of the Cork O'Connor series in order to appreciate this particular story. So very often now I point readers to Lightning Strike and say, this is a good place to begin, because what you will get is an introduction to me as a storyteller. You'll see the characters that will be involved in the Cork O'Connor stories, the kinds of elements that every Cork O'Connor story will offer you, and you'll get such a good sense of me as a storyteller. And if you like that, then start with Iron Lake and move through the series.
So Sam says, I have no question, but just want to share how much I absolutely adored this tender land and can't wait to pick up Ordinary Grace.
Oh, good. I'm really pleased to hear that.
And Joyce is wondering if you're writing something now.
Yeah, I'm always writing something. It's what I do. I have just finished and sent to my editor what I believe are close to the final revisions for the next book in the Cork O'Connor series. It's a novel that will be called Fox Creek, and it will be published in August of next year. I'm at work on two standalones. One is definitely a companion novel to Ordinary Grace in This Tender Land, in that it takes place again in the Minnesota River Valley, in the town of New Bremen, and it's also set in an earlier time, as are those two other novels. And then I'm at work on what is really a fairly straightforward but rather epic mystery. And we'll see how that plays out, but not a part of my Cork O'Connor series.
This Tender Land would be a wonderful movie. You know, it really would be a nice, I would go see it.
Well, we're in negotiations right now for the film rights.
Oh.
Don't hold your breath. There is currently a screenplay is the film rights to Ordinary Grace have been optioned, and a screenplay is currently being written. My Cork O'Connor series was optioned for years, and nothing ever came of it. So, you know, I have adopted the long view on all of this. Don't hold your breath.
Okay. So what do you like to read?
You know, I like to read mysteries because it's my genre, and I have lots of friends who are at work writing mysteries, and I try as best I can to keep abreast of what they're doing. If I'm not reading in the mystery genre, I tend to read Midwest authors. I've often made the case that there is a Midwest voice in literature. It's a very spare voice, but very eloquent, and rises, I believe, very much out of our understanding of our relationship with the land here in the Midwest. We take great pride here in believing that we have shaped the land, but in truth, the land has also shaped us. So if the name Marilyn Robinson means anything to you, I love her work. Many years ago, she wrote a book called Gilead, which won the National Book Award. Before that was a classic novel called Housekeeping. Most recently, I think Lila. She came out with Lila. So she's a favorite of mine. Louise Erdrich here in Minnesota, just a fine Ojibwe storyteller. This guy named Kent Krueger, who died a few years ago, who set his work on the plains of Colorado. His work is about just regular people in small towns on the eastern plains of Colorado. But his portrayal, his compassionate portrayal of these people is just so beautiful. So I always recommend Kent Krueger. The poetry of, never mind. His name just
It'll
went
come
out
to
of
you.
my head. I can see him. Why can't I think of his name? Anyway.
Well, it'll come. All right, let me see, I did that one. Living so close to the Native Americans and having friends, would you consider writing a book including something like Moses' transition to adulthood?
Do you know, I have told really the story of the vagabonds as much as I'm going to deal with their story. At the moment, I have no plans to follow the trajectory of any of the vagabonds' lives beyond this tender land. But life is long, so who knows?
Never say never. And Caroline said, thank you. No, that you have been talking about spirituality. Thank you, she said.
You're welcome.
How do you organize your writing time while working on 3 different projects? Jane wants to know.
Well, I'm never working actually on 2 manuscripts at the same time. Like I don't work on one manuscript in the morning and another manuscript at the evening. I'm usually focused on one manuscript for a while, and then for whatever reason, if I need to put it aside, then I work on the other one. So that's how I've been working on the 2 standalone stories. For a while, I focus on one, and then for reasons I will go into, I'll need to set it aside. And then because I need to be writing, then I move to the other manuscript, that story, and work on it for a while. But I'm never like juggling the 2 of them together. I have friends who do that, and I just don't know how they can, because when I'm in a manuscript, that's where all of it consumes all of my imaginative thinking.
Yeah. Anyone have any questions? Open it up.
Me again, sorry. Can you tell us about your writing process? I'm just curious about, writers sort of have like the special room they write in, or the special time they write, or like, do you write every day? Do you have a time of day? Do you just like sit down and write it from beginning till end and just, I don't know.
Yeah. Most of my colleagues, most of my writer friends whose processes I know are very like me. If you earn your living through your writing, you have to be writing, because you always have deadlines that you are contractually obligated to meet. There are other reasons to be writing every day, but that's how most of us write. For 40 years now, my alarm clock has gone off at 6:15 every morning, 7 days a week. I get up, I get myself dressed, and before the pandemic set in, I would go to a coffee shop where I would spend the first 2 or even sometimes 3 hours a day writing. Now that the pandemic has forced us to shelter in place, I've exchanged my kitchen counter for the coffee shop. But I'm married to the world's most wonderful woman. She has pledged to stay in bed every morning until I've finished with my writing, so she doesn't interrupt me. Then on a typical day, my wife and I will have breakfast together. When I finish my writing, we'll do the New York Times crossword puzzle together. Then I go to the YMCA and do what I hope is a rigorous workout. I come home, have breakfast or have lunch, and then in the afternoon, early afternoon, I do the business of being a writer, which is communicating with my agent or my editor or answering notes that I get from readers. And then I try in the afternoon to do another hour, hour and a half of the creative work. And that's pretty much a typical day for me. And as I explained, in terms of my writing process, when I'm writing a Cork O'Connor story, I usually know before I begin where I'm going to take that story. With my standalones, I have adopted an entirely different process. I just love that the story reveals itself to me. And I enjoyed that for my standalones. I would never approach a Cork O'Connor novel that way. I write on a laptop. I wrote my first 8 or 9 novels in the Cork O'Connor series longhand in cheap wirebound notebooks with a big pen. But then on one of the novels, I was behind deadline. And, you know, if you write longhand, one step is taking that messy stuff in the notebook and transcribing it into a word processing system of some kind. And that takes time. So I thought to myself, well, if I could compose directly to the computer, maybe I could meet deadline, which was a scary proposition for me because there was ritual, there was magic in writing longhand. It was like the idea started here and it passed through my heart and down my arm, through the pen onto the page. And I was afraid if I monkeyed with that magic, maybe it wouldn't happen anymore. But I went ahead and tried it and it works. So I compose to my laptop now. Anything else?
Yeah, this was great. I really appreciate you joining us in Westwood.
It's been my pleasure. And should you as a group ever decide to read one of my other novels, invite me back.
Oh, we will. You can count on it. Next year, Ordinary Grace.
All right. I love hearing that. Well, in the meantime, everybody have a really joyous holiday season and keep reading.
You
Yes.
too. Thank you very much.
you for your
Thank
time.
you very much.
Bye-bye.
Great evening.
Night all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.